Good morning and welcome to our study of Mipham Rinpoche's Sword of Wisdom. And even though it says the Nyingma approach to valid cognition, there will be some things here which are particular to the Nyingma traditions. But in general, as far as most of what we're studying here, it's really not just, you could say, common to all the various schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but in fact, all of Mahayana Buddhism. We quote Dharmakirti a lot. And the whole topic here, pramana, is of course implicit in the Buddha's teaching, because it's really about where the Buddha says you should only accept my teaching on the basis of your own inquiry. There is the entire spirit of the Buddhist teaching is very much that we accept it on the basis of our experience. And in this way, it's not about accepting dogma blindly, but this notion of accurate understanding of reality and not just tagging along with you could say blind dogma, or tagging along with, you could say, or just remaining in some particular space as if that would be spirituality. That's where Dignaga in the 5th century and Dharmakirti then in the 7th century, they very much also in dialogue with their contemporaries. You could say the traditions of India were very much scientific in the sense of primarily identifying how mind is key really to our understanding of reality, and as such, the ones that were seen to understand reality were essentially the spiritual traditions. So that's where the compassion of masters such as Dignaga and Dharmakirti really resulted in the development of a modality of conversation, which is essentially just like we have it in modern science. We have different schools that will discuss different views and so forth. And essentially also that's basic to Karl Popper's famous notion of science has to be falsifiable. There has to be something that we can verify and that we can see, okay, this can be true, it cannot be true. And we can actually go in and we can assess that on the basis of valid ways of understanding reality. And this way we have a conversation. Otherwise, it's just like retreating into, okay, I believe this, And that unfortunately happens nowadays where people just say, oh, well, so-and-so is just a Buddhist, they have their ideas, they probably believe, all sorts of fanciful things like rebirth and nirvana and stuff like that, But let them, in the name of, freedom of religion, let people believe in, what is it again, the green spaghetti monster and these kind of things. So that's where that obviously is not very helpful. And that's where the traditions in India very much were in conversation. And you could say Buddhism nowadays has yet actually to be sort of taken out of the sort of framework of religion and actually be part of a larger conversation. That has yet to take place. We still have, the majority of the population will say, oh yeah, well, the Buddhists, they believe something, they're doing something. They're religious, so they will believe all sorts of strange things. But they're nice people. The Dalai Lama's a nice guy, so why not? That sort of thing. So that's a little bit of a sad situation that doesn't really go very far, and that's where the study of pramana that we're undertaking right now is so important. And you'll forgive me for going on a little bit on a tangent here. What essentially the ontology or the worldview that we have in Buddhism, just like you could say ontology is the way that we, for example, see the universe. The universe is made up of particles of various kinds that are the basis for biological system, and also you could say we have the animate and inanimate universe and so forth. So in this way we understand our world in particular ways, and this is how we were brought up to believe. There's this sort of world out there, and then there's us, the inhabitants, the various species of living creatures reptiles and mammals and what have you. So all of these various sort of ways that we understand the world and saying this is our reality, that's what we call ontology. That's how we say, okay, that's how the world is. The Buddhist teaching, we're linked very much up with what we could call epistemology. We would say our way of seeing the world is entirely tied up of whether we're seeing it accurately or not. And that's where the Buddhist understanding is we see our world in terms of how it is, or how it just being caught on the appearances, in which case that's entirely something that we project on the basis of our individual perceptions. And so essentially what we have in as ontology in Buddhism is what we could call two phenomenologies, two ways of experience. One is samsara, one is nirvana. So that's where understanding reality for what it is, that's nirvana, that's awakening, that's liberation. Being confused and being caught in our projections and the patterns and anguish of our projections and so forth is samsara. And if being deluded, was bliss, if ignorance really was bliss, and if everyone was having a jolly good time in the delusion, then I'm sure the Buddha wouldn't mind. But just like sometimes, people are very happy in their delusion in some way. A friend of mine had a condition with the brain, and he was rather a serious, difficult person. And after he had this condition with the brain, yeah, he was a little bit delusional, but he was a very happy person. And you were kind of just like, oh well, you know. But this is different. In the case of samsara, there is continual suffering, and that's where the Buddha is coming from, and seeing that this condition of delusion is not helpful. This is everybody's suffering as a consequence of this. So that's where something needs to be done. So anyway, it's on that basis then that Buddha prescribed the path, but it's important for us to understand this path then in terms of understanding that it's about what we can experience and verify and continually take back to what is the most real dimension of our reality, which is our experience. And that experience is not just understood in terms of making further abstractions about what creates it or whatever. It's about immediately what we can feel and what are the dynamics in terms of the cause and effect within what we experience and feel. Actually, as far as the traditional ontology that we have, which is very much the materialist notion that there's a solid world out there and there's what we call a causal closure, there's consciousness here and there's the world out there. We have actually quantum physics, which for the last 100 years actually have been positing how consciousness is actually the observer is you could say contribute to the way that we perceive things. And right now I was just reading in the news the other day, there's a professor of science or a teacher of science of some sort who's actually making a trek. I think he's on his he's walking, I can't remember if it was his dog, but he's just walking from somewhere in Victoria and to Adelaide. There's a 600 kilometer trek he's making because he's protesting against that in schools still they're teaching the standard model of physics without actually incorporating the insights of quantum mechanics. So essentially what's being taught to our children is this very antiquated world view. This is also a point that Professor Emeritus Henry Stapp from Johns Hopkins University in the States, he's also made this point. He wrote a book called The Mindful Universe. And in there also, he points out how the findings of quantum physics is actually something that just hasn't filtered into the mainstream view of our world and basically our ontology. So anyway, this is a little bit just to talk about the reality that we're looking at and the premises for how could we validly understand our reality. And that's the subject that we're looking at here. And what, of course, I'm trying to say is that this has enormous relevance for our particular practice and also for our understanding of the Buddhist teaching in general. So now someone's saying that I'm continuing with this course, although I'm far behind in the readings. I still get a lot out of it. Yeah, that's no problem. And there are the recordings and all of that. So most of what we do all gets recorded. All right. So famous for his long introductions. The lecturer now finally gets around to, we'll have questions at the end. We'll start with invoking Jakob Leschly. Through the blessing of awareness emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. Okay. So we presently reached the fourth of the 4 reasonings. So we're applying reasoning, and this is also really an important point. Again, we're not just tagging along with sort of saying, yes, sir. We apply reasoning for everything that we're doing on the Buddhist path. Now, we then have various kinds of reasonings, and we've looked at the causal efficacy and dependency, which is basic to understanding essentially how we can understand things. And then last time we looked at the nature of things. And that's, of course, where the nature of things, they have so many, everything has its particular nature. The nature of this device here is telling me time. But again, that's understood in terms of its relative appearance. There might be maybe one day there will, well, let's say my computer, for example, especially the older computers where there was a lot of space inside. Ants would love to go inside computers. So the ant would see the computer as a potential home. And so the way that nature is perceived is different according to who's observing it. It's what we call relative truth. The actual nature is what we call absolute truth, the emptiness of things. And that's what we looked at last time. And then we could say the nature of everything that we observe and experience is essentially understood in terms of these 2 truths. And this is also really the theme of this work here, is understanding the 2 truths, the relative truth and absolute truth. Now, the 4th reasoning then that we're looking at is what we call the explanation of valid proof, valid cognition. And that's us looking, and this is really the epistemology, that is looking at how do we know what we know? And how is it that we relate to things? And again, this is where we're going to be working a lot with what actually directly happens every micro moment in terms of our experience. So again, this is where it's helpful to be a meditator. If we're used to just sitting around and thinking of the world in terms of politics and in terms of all sorts of belief systems that get handed down to us in the common conversations, then we're lost in some very abstract, you could say, distant, very cerebral perspectives. Here, it's about coming down to what we can actually immediately feel and verify. So it requires that we get a lot out of our heads and actually begin to relate to what we can directly connect with right here, right now. And that's where then, on the basis of that, we can begin to understand our reality. In the text, it says, as was just explained, valid comprehension of a thing accords with the nature of the 2 truths and is established through the power of fact. This is the reasoning of a valid proof. So again, the 2 truths are not 2 truths that we just say, yes, sir, but they're established on the basis of us actually investigating and assessing what is being talked about. So that's where we use reasoning. We use what we can directly, validly understand. So Khenpo Palten Sherab says, as was just explained, valid comprehension of something happens in accord with the nature of the 2 truths. This applies to the appearance of the object being comprehended, which is the nature of the relative truth, and to the emptiness of the object, which is the nature of the absolute truth. The subjective mind, which arises owing to an object appearing and comprehends according to the object's nature, is established through the power of the actual way things are. This is called the reasoning of a valid proof or a valid cognition. So when we look at something, let's say I look at a computer, and then I have a particular way that I see it, whereas my friend the ant, who's looking for a home where it's nice and cozy and she goes sort of warm possibly, and all sorts of ways can remain undisturbed. Actually, we had this projector here. It was a very good projector, which was bought by Siddhartha's Intent. Um, and there was, I can't remember, for one reason or another, there was a time some period where we weren't using it, I think in conjunction with COVID. And it was a very expensive piece of technology. Anyway, I hadn't used it for, I don't know, maybe a year or something. And then I opened it up and it was just full of ants. They had just all invaded and there was just ants everywhere. Anyway, I'm digressing here. Luckily, Michela is now lending us her projector, so we're all good. But anyway, we lost this expensive piece of equipment simply just because they didn't understand it was a projector. They couldn't read that it said, projector or whatever, and they thought it was a place they could live. See, that's relative truth. Subjectivities perceive objects differently. Now, the thing about what is it then? Is it a home or is it a projector? Well, actually, it's only from our point of view that it is a projector. It's equally valid, unless we're very aggressive and, I don't know, supremacist, that we think our truth is more valid than that of the ant. But that's, again, very easy to poke a hole in. That's entirely just our perceptions. In this case, there were probably 1,000 ants living in there, and there was just me. So it was 1,000 against one. So there was clearly, you could say, in democratic terms, there was clearly a majority for that being a home and not a projector. Anyway, this truth about the projector is, as we can see, relative, and that means that the projector actually lives or exists outside of the projections that we put onto it. And understanding that is understanding absolute truth. That is understanding that, in fact, it's just a dependently arisen phenomena on the basis of particular perceptions. And again, if we analyze it, we can break it down infinitely, and we'll never find anything except just the imputed particles that constitute it. So that's why we say here, the subjective mind, which arises owing to an object appearing. Yeah, and there's an object out there, something, and comprehends according to the object's nature. That something is established, projector, home, through the power of the way things are. So that's where relatively it's perceived as a home or projector. Absolutely, it's understood in terms of its absence of any ultimate, true, permanent identity. So using that kind of approach is about using reasoning. So this is called reasoning of a valid proof or valid cognition, and that's what we're on to here. Now we're going to be looking at various ways in which we then engage with the objects. Anyway, right now it says here, the Sutra of the Definitive Explanation of the Intent, again, as it's in 84,000 called Unraveling the Intent. It says, the reasoning of a valid proof is what establishes the facts of what is stated or explained or thought based on whatever causes and conditions are involved, so that the facts are completely understood. In other words, we look at things. We don't just have an opinion or an attitude or an idea, but we actually are interested in what is beyond the appearances. And that's where we understand something on the basis of our investigation. Dharmakirti's commentary on valid cognition, Pramanavartika, states, valid cognition is the unmistaken conscious mind. And that is exactly the definition we have of science. It is understanding things properly. So that's where we presently here have a completely common cause with the natural sciences. Now, Dharmakirti also says, in defining valid cognition as being unmistaken, there are three features. The first is the object. When valid cognition is unmistaken about an object, the object determined in this way is a specific phenomenon. That's where we go beyond appearances and we actually look at something. Ah, pencil. Aha. Then we know about the pencil. This is This is unmistakably a pencil. This is just how we would understand in terms of the object, right? The second is the subject, the unmistaken mind, which consists of the two types of valid cognition. And that's when, again, where we would look at this in terms of a mind that can see it directly, or if I can't see it directly, I put it down in the place where I can't see it. I know that it was there. I can infer that it's probably still there. So that's where we have direct perception and we have inferential cognition. Sorry. The third is the way in which valid cognition is unmistaken. When determining that something exists, valid cognition is unmistaken about its existence. So here's a world of objects, here's a world of subjectivities, and then something needs to be known about it. And that's where then the science or the pramana or the valid cognition is concerned. It is valid when it is unmistaken. That's where it would become, you could say, sound science or valid cognition. When determining that something exists, valid cognition is unmistaken about its existence, and when determining that something does not exist, it is unmistaken about its non-existence. So that's where we can rely on what's sound science, what's flawed science, what is true, what's not true. And this valid cognition that does that. This is not about being judgmental. It's not about us having the freedom to think what we want, which of course we are. But in terms of us actually navigating reality, then it's important to know what's what. In Australia, you drive in the left side of the road. You might come from Europe and you might have a flawed assumption that here you can drive in the right side of the road. Doesn't work. It takes actual relating to the phenomenal world to understand how it functions. Similarly, when determining the identity of a thing, valid cognition is unmistaken about the way the thing is or the way the thing is not. Okay. Similarly, the way things appear and the way they are comprehended according to their natures, either by direct perception or by inference of something else, which is unmistaken because it relies on what directly appears. Okay, so we understand something that, for example, fire, and then we can't see seeing the fire directly. That's direct perception. So then we can know something about fire and all of that. But the main thing is we're actually seeing the fire, the object. Then there's the moment we don't see the fire, but we can see smoke, and that's where we can infer the presence of fire on the basis of something that's not the fire, but there's a sign. And so that also is regarded as unmistaken. Of course, it could be that somebody's just started up a smoke machine, but in general, we would say inference is something that generally we can rely on. So I put a pencil down, I can't see it anymore, but I remember that I put it there. I can pretty much assume that it's there. This is not about belief. This is about just simply inference. So the way things appear is the relative truth, and the way things are is the absolute truth. Remember this, yeah? That the projector, home or projector or whatever, that's relative truth. It depends on how we see things differently. I might have a lovely person that comes over and he votes very differently from how I do it, but because of his conditioning and his particular priorities and his particular whatever, a number of things, then we can understand that we're looking at the same object and seeing things very differently. So that's relative truth, and the absolute truth is things as they are without our particular subjective opinion. Each of these has its own nature, which is realized either immediately through a direct perception or inferentially through an unmistaken inference based on directly appearing sign of another object. So we can know things even though we don't see them directly. We can base our sort of knowledge on you could say the logic of inferring on the basis of some sign. So direct perception. So now we're going to look at we're going to look at direct perception, which is the first. We have the direct perception and we have inferential perception. So which we just talked about, and now the first of these is then when we directly are looking at something. But there's various ways in which we can directly perceive something. And this is where we look at ourselves and what we experience. This is not something abstract. This is something that we have right here, right now. So the general explanation of direct perception. There are four kinds of direct perception: unmistaken sensory perception, mental perception, self-aware perception, and yogic perception. Since their objects are appearing specific phenomena, direct perception is not conceptual. Without direct perception, there would be no evidence, so there could be no inference. All appearances would be impossible, such as the way things arise from causes and then cease. Therefore, it is by relying on evidence that one understands emptiness and so forth. Without relying on the conventional, one cannot realize the absolute. So the first is the four kinds of direct perceptions. Very simply just, I'm looking at my hand. That's direct perception. Then I'm not seeing my hand right now, but if somebody says hand, on the basis of having seen a few hands in my life, I can conjure up an image of hand in my mind. So that's where somebody says, if I say to somebody, Woolies, then immediately, bing, an image comes up. So we know what we're talking about. It's right there. If I say Woolies again, then again, the idea of Woolies will come up. So it's constantly that we're operating with images, you know. I say Tsongsa Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, an image comes up, the face, you know, Rinpoche, whatever. Self-aware perception, that's the naked knowing quality that we perceive. This is a very interesting point, but that is actually just this quality of cognizing, just knowing. There's not necessarily an object involved, but there's just simply a knowing. Finally, there's yogic perception, and that's what emerges when there's greater clarity. We might, for example, be hallucinating, and we don't really see clearly, or we might be really in a state, and others around us will know that we're not really seeing clearly. Whereas somebody who's a bit calm, we understand they see clearly. And taking that to the nth degree, taking calm to the nth degree, then also on the basis of just, you could say, insight and prajna, there's a place where yogis begin to see things that are not obvious to the rest of us. And that's what we talk about as yogic direct perception. It's not beliefs. It's not about going into a trance. It's simply just seeing clearly. And that's also where we can consult the Dalai Lama on various matters. And we rely on him just because he's not carried away or in a state. There's that insight. And we very often think of this in terms of wisdom or whatever. So that's yogic perception. That's simply just what is the result of clarifying the mind. So, but all of this is really just about directly engaging with objects. Simply, there's not a conceptual process necessarily involved in any of this. And it's on the basis of this kind of observing phenomena and seeing phenomena that we can actually know something about how the world works. We have some idea of how things arise in this world. So it's basis of us observing. There's a seed put in the ground. We observe the little seed go in the ground, and then we observed, oh, a carrot came out. So we understand how there is a process taking place. Or, for example, our own sort of experience. You know, we think in terms of how I'm feeling right now. Well, it's on the basis of, you know, what I did earlier, etc. So all the time there is an understanding of how the world works. And that's where for us to have that, we need to have that direct engagement and experience of what's happening. And that's again the role of direct perception enables us to understand the world that we live in. So it's also on the basis of that we begin to also penetrate through to the actual nature of things, which is then the ultimate or absolute nature of phenomena. But it's on the basis of observing relative phenomena that we understand absolute phenomena. We're looking at things. I'm looking at my watch, thinking, oh, watch. For me to understand absolute reality is actually that I begin to analyze, is there really that watchness in this? I said, no, there's not. That's where we say, nothing can withstand absolute analysis. Nothing withstands. Anything that we look at, we understand how it's made up of parts, how it's imputed in particular ways. And that's our gateway to understanding the ultimate. Sometimes there's maybe a sort of a simple idea that, oh, the ultimate, that's something that has nothing to do with the world. It has nothing to do with our reality. And that, of course, is where in the Heart Sutra we have the famous saying, form is emptiness, but emptiness also is form, and so forth. Anyway, so we have these. So then again, we have Dharmakirti, who, by the way, is our great hero in terms of the whole study of valid cognition, one of our heroes. So he has a synopsis here of what we mean with direct perception, these four kinds that we just looked at before. So so the first then, and this is from his work, which is called The Essence of Reasoning. Yeah. And anyway, it says direct perception is non-conceptual and unmistaken. Conceptualization is the mixing of names with appearances in one's consciousness, and direct perception is free from that. Okay? Now here I have a cup. Now I might also begin to say, oh, nice cup, and lovely tea, and all of that. And I develop sort of a relationship with this cup here. But that's my concepts. But just seeing the cup itself, that's what we would essentially talk of as direct perception. We would say that there's a moment where we just see this cup before the whole gang, the whole gang of sort of concepts arrive, you know. First there's the avant-garde that just sort of touches it and go, oh, and then comes, oh, nice cup and expensive cup and ooh, very, very pricey, you know, Wedgwood sort of porcelain or whatever, you know, from Woolies on a sale. Anyway, all these are secondary, and the direct perception is free from that. Direct perception is consciousness free of the distortions produced by things like an eye disorder, spinning rapidly, being on a moving boat, or bodily disturbance. So there's all these things that essentially distort ways that we see things that we ordinarily understand as actually being something that distorts what we're seeing. So our concepts are a bit like that. So there are four kinds of direct perception. There's one with sense consciousness, just this seeing with the eye, hearing with the ear, and so forth. Mental direct perception, or the mental consciousness, which has a sense cognition as its similar and immediate condition for producing its own mental object immediately after the sense cognition. So that's where I look at a hand, and then there's still an image of a hand that is there in my mind. Self-aware direct perception, which is the primary mind and all the mental states. And that's where we have this cognition that simply just takes place in terms of, you could say, the quality of knowing. But of course, with that also, there's also various states that sort of come on the basis of that. But essentially, this is the primary condition of our reality. And then there's yogic direct perception, which is consciousness immersed in genuine being, which arises as the culmination of meditation on ultimate reality. And that's simply just where the yogis shed the ordinary distortions. They shed the ordinary corruption of understanding reality. So that's why the yogi's insight has relevance for everyone. The Buddha's insight has relevance for all sentient beings. It's not like the Buddha is off on a different planet or a different sphere. The Buddha has shed confusion with regards to the world that we're living in. So that's where we talk about yogic direct perception. Now, the object of a direct perception is a specific phenomenon, which means an object that appears differently when it is cognized nearby or at a distance. So that's a particular, okay, that's again where we talk about specific phenomena. This is important because it stands in opposition to generalities. Here's a pencil, right? This is the pencil. This is my pencil. And this is a, I don't know what it's called, DATS. Anyway, this is the pencil. But if I say, where's my pencil? Or what's your opinion about pencils? We definitely have a very clear image of something real, but it's a generality. That's very different from actually sitting in front of a particular object. So we make the distinction between these two. So the object of a direct perception is not the mental image of pencils, but it's the direct thing that we're seeing. Then Dharmakirti says, specific phenomena ultimately exist. They are causally effective things which are defined as the only things capable of performing functions. See, I can't write with the idea of a pen, you know? I say, where's my pen? And somebody says, oh yes, there is pen. Pens do exist. And isn't it interesting with pens? Let's talk about pens. And then you go, no, I need my pen because I need to write something. So that's why it doesn't help to sit around talking about pens or having ideas of pens. We need actual things that are capable of performing functions. So other things, and that's this point here, other things are generalities, which are the objects of inference. So we can understand pens and pencils in general. They're generalities, but the specific object is an object of direct perception. The directly perceiving consciousness is established as the effect of valid cognition. So this is where the consciousness that sees this comes up with an understanding of what this is. And luckily, I don't think it's a gummy that I can start eating. It's something that is a pencil, and I then have what I can say a valid cognition of this particular specific phenomenon. So this is because a directly perceiving consciousness itself is identical with the ascertainment of an object. Simple as that. I don't think about it, just there's pencil. It is a valid cognition of an image or a semblance of an object because it is due to the image that the object is ascertained. So that's where in my mind there creates then a clear understanding of what this object is. So again, as far as these four types of valid cognition goes, there are, and then again, this is just going over this once again, this is an important point. There are four types of valid or validly cognizing direct perception. There is valid sensory direct perception that is not flawed by something like an eye disorder, as well as valid mental direct perception, self-aware direct perception, and yogic direct perceptions. Here are their definitions, one by one. Okay, this is Khenpo Pautin Sherpa. Valid sensory direct perception, like we looked at, is defined as an unmistaken and non-conceptual consciousness that arises on the basis of a physical sense faculty as its ruling condition. Meaning I see something on the basis mainly on my eye functioning properly, I see the pencil or whatever. There are five types of sensory direct perception. The unmistaken consciousness of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and feeling. An example of a false direct perception is when a single moon appears as two moons because of a distortion caused by a defective sense faculty. This is not valid cognition. So indeed, I press my eyeball and I might end up seeing two moons. But again, we all know that is not valid cognition. That's something that was distorted. Valid mental direct perception is defined as a non-conceptual and unmistaken consciousness that arises on the basis of a mental faculty as a ruling condition. Again, I say hand, and in everyone's mind, the image of a hand arises. That's because of that we previously have seen hands, but it's essentially right now the mental faculty that is creating that particular image. So that's that's also something we can use. It's what we use all the time, from anything in terms of, you could say, real world objects to subtle abstract phenomena like mathematics. An example of invalid mental direct perception is consciousness during a dream, or a non-conceptual mental consciousness that ensues from a defective sense faculty. I'm not exactly sure I understand that, but I won't babble on about that, but that's where I can't confidently actually explain that, because you'd think that that would be just any old object that comes up in a dream. But we could have essentially hallucinations, I suppose, that comes about due to, or maybe if we're hit on the head, we see little stars and planets, and possibly that would be, you could say, a non-conceptual mental consciousness that is seen there, but it's not valid. There's not actual stars and planets. Possibly that's what it means. Valid yogic direct perception is defined as non-conceptual and unmistaken consciousness that arises on the basis of shamatha and vipassana meditation as its ruling condition. So that's where, on the basis of somebody practicing shamatha and vipassana, as we do, then there is a calm condition in which insight emerges. Khenpo Palden says the vivid appearance of a skeleton when meditating on repulsiveness is not considered valid cognition because it is mistaken. And that's where we might, if we're meditating on impermanence, we might meditate on seeing everything as skeletons, all people as skeletons. But that's actually not necessarily a valid cognition. That's essentially just something that's been conjured up. So that kind of meditation is not really what we mean with shamatha and vipassana. That's essentially just a hallucination or something that arises not exactly as a hallucination, but on the basis of just a particular concentration. And then there's valid self-aware direct perception is defined as non-conceptual and unmistaken self-awareness, which is the essential clarity of the primary mind and all mental states. So it's simply just the naked cognitive condition that's present regardless of what state we're in. It's the nature of mind that's there, whether we're in a good mood or bad mood, whether we are having thoughts or no thoughts. There is a cognition that's basic to all of that. No matter what type of consciousness arises, whether mistaken or unmistaken, the bare experience of its inherent clarity is unmistaken and non-conceptual. So we could have all sorts of perceptions, thoughts, mental states, moods, and so forth. And they can be, you could say, valid. And that's again, like we looked at before. Some can be maybe just like a dream, or they can be actual objects right here, right now. But the bottom line is that there's cognition taking place. When we talk about inherent clarity, we're just talking about the cognitive quality that's always present with any given experience. And that's also where the meditators, they identify this as being something that is valid way of understanding our reality. It's where we begin to understand our experience without necessarily the distortion that takes place of all the entanglements in terms of our changing conditional experiences. So then it says here, there is no inference without direct perception. So we wouldn't have knowledge of the world if it wasn't that we actually saw and experienced things such as little seeds and sprouts becoming, big vegetables or trees. So without the four types of direct perception, there would be no evidence, such as the appearance of smoke, and in consequence, there would be no inference of something such as the presence of fire. So on the basis of us being familiar with the phenomenal world through our direct perceptions, then there is an understanding such as there's a fire if there is a smoke. And similarly also the other kinds of valid cognition. Without inference, it would be impossible to comprehend all the phenomena of this world, including conventional forms and sounds, and things like the way sprouts arise from seeds and then disintegrate and cease. So us navigating the world is on the basis of essentially what we can empirically, that we can manifestly assert, and you can say verify, in terms of just the appearances or the objects of these various kinds of direct perceptions. Therefore, it is by relying on evidence to provide proof that one will understand that the true nature of relative truth is emptiness and so forth. And again, when we're talking about the actual understanding of reality, which is then how things actually are, it's on the basis of us approaching this in terms of investigation, analysis, and valid cognition. The Khenpo says otherwise, if there were no evidence, there would be no understanding. It is said that without relying on the conventional truth of the appearances of the world as the method, there would be no realization of the absolute truth emptiness, which arises from method. So that's where the method is of us actually investigating where we are, what we're experiencing, and making that the foundation of our insight. It's not that it would come from anywhere else. So it's about us immediately. And this is the very nature of what we call upaya, or skillful means, is that we look at and utilize and turn into a vehicle for our understanding our present immediate experience. So it's on the basis of analyzing phenomena that we then see their ultimate nature. Without that, without us looking and seeing how phenomena exist as dependently arisen phenomena, then there would be no understanding of what we mean with emptiness. In relation to this, glorious Chandrakirti, in his commentary, Clear Words, says, therefore, since it is the method for attaining nirvana, without a doubt one must first accept the nature of the relative truth as it is, in the same way that a thirsty man must first accept something like a container to drink from. So for us to begin to understand nirvana, we need to actually first have something that actually enables us to relate to it. In his commentary to the entrance to the middle way, Chandrakirti also says, it is taught that the absolute abides only in the conventional truth. However, it is by thoroughly assimilating the teachings on the absolute that the absolute will be attained. So we need to look at our world, and it's only through looking at our world that we'll understand the nature of our world, our reality. But for us to be able to understand that, to be able to actually have the proper valid cognition that enables us to approach and understand, that's where we need the apparatus or the optics of seeing clearly. And that's where we need to assimilate the teachings on the absolute so that we can see clearly. So that doesn't mean that what we are engaging, that the absolute is understood as something that's created on the basis of the method, but the method is something that enables us to see clearly. Just like, for example, we look to the skies, and with having proper optics, proper telescopes, then we can see what's in the heavens. But it's not as if what we're seeing is something that is created by the instrument itself. Next, here are the specific descriptions of sensory direct perception, mental direct perception, self-aware direct perception, and yogic direct perception. So we're going to go over them one by one. So here we've really just looked at a summary, and then I think next time we'll probably look at I think we'll probably stop here. So the next will be then dealing with these one by one, the various ways of direct perception. In Tibetan, it's Myeonsum Tsema, which means the valid cognition of what is manifest. Okay, good. Okay. It seems the Sutra of Unraveling the Intent cannot be found on 84,000 app. Oh, okay. Really? Okay, I'll have a look. Okay, have attempted unsuccessfully to locate this for some weeks. Whoops. Well, let me. I'm really curious about that. Anyway, I'll look into it. When in the West we use the word science alongside valid cognition, we must remember quantum science views things from a completely different perspective to many of the other scientific fields. We in the West tend to want to validate our cognition through the concepts of science being some form of relative ultimate truth. This can also perpetuate the falling into relative truth, yes. Yes, well, the distinction between quantum science and the conventional standard model of physics is, of course, a big topic. And I am sitting here very much as a Buddhist that's actually just understanding Buddhism with reference to, you could say, familiar themes that dominate the discourse in our culture. So from that point of view, I'm very interested in quantum physics and the standard model of physics. Quantum science versus the standard model of physics. But of course, what I think is a bottom line for both quantum physics and the standard model of physics, quantum science and quantum mechanics and the standard model of physics, what's basic to that is actually what we're using here, which is again valid cognition. We haven't arrived. Quantum physicists didn't arrive at quantum science by any other means than that which we're using here, which is direct perception and inference. So it's on the basis of observation and on the basis of assessing what is, you could say, the way in which the world functions, that we then begin to have a wider perspective, which is what quantum physics is opening up. So that's where there's a so that's where we are essentially looking. We're navigating relative truth, and that's generally the scope of the conventional science as we have it in the West. Yeah, let me see if I'm understanding your question properly. We in the West tend to want to validate our cognition through the concept of science being some form of relative or ultimate truth. Well, that's the thing. Yes, there is definitely an understanding of both relative and ultimate truth, of course, in any science. But there would still be basic to Western science. And again, this is, you know, I'm a little bit, you know, not mastering the language of that would be particular to the way this is articulated within the context of Western discourse or Western scientific discourse, right? But there would still be the assertion, and this we can see, for example, in the there would still be the assertion that there is actual, you could say, building blocks of reality, and that's basic to, for example, the whole project that we have with the, for example, CERN accelerator in Switzerland, which was built and at great costs involving many scientists and so forth, to essentially arrive at what are the subtle building blocks of phenomena. So you come up with these things like Higgs boson, or we talks about quarks or whatever, where we're always operating with that there would be some subtle absolute, and that's where the ultimate truth that you have there in this science corresponds to what we have in the Buddhist context of what we call the Vibhashika view, which is where we talk about indestructible particles. Essentially, that's also the meaning of atom, but that there is something which is, you could say, the building blocks of phenomena. But the thing is, the more we go in, and this is where you could say there's a common ground between Western science and modern and Buddhism, is that the more you look at what Western science is finding, is more and more it's subtle, and more we're just talking about energies. And for example, Higgs boson is just something that exists in terms of time and space, absolutely minutely, something that's just barely there, if you like. So that's where, like, what is it, the French philosopher of science, André Miguet, he said, you know, it's more and more looking like just, it's really more like an idea. It's more our understanding eventually is looking more and more like just ideas. So that's where you could say there's a meeting place of Western science and Buddhism. But of course, having already established this this having this insight. This is where you could say Buddhism begins, and in the Western science, this is kind of the outer frontiers. So there's still you could say there's a big difference in terms of the understanding of reality. Anyway, this can also perpetuate the falling into relative truth. Well, yes, because primarily everything that we understand then as relative truth in the Buddhist teaching is really the scope of science, because also the objective is different. In the Buddhist teaching, the objective is enlightenment. In Western science, it's more about just being able to understand and navigate our reality so that we're more comfortable. So we're, thanks to science, we have all sorts of wonderful things, technologies, medicine, and so forth. So all of that leads to a profound insight into how we can use the phenomenal relative world. So that's, you could say, we're very grateful to that. You know, even the venerable lamas, they will always go to, be very keen to follow Western medicine, you know. So that's where there's not really a conflict. It's just that one has sort of looked more into the objective realm of the material, and the other is looking at enlightenment. We could see belief as a form of inference. It comes down to what is conventionally considered sufficient evidence. Okay, yeah, that's probably true. Might it be that one person's yogic direct perception is considered belief by someone else who doesn't see clearly? Definitely. That's where you could say you have a really angry person who's saying so and so is a terrible person, and then there's one who's a bit calm who will just say, well, you know, yes, maybe this person appears to be a terrible person, but in fact the person is just, you know, it's due to conditions. So that's where the calm person sees, you say, the complexity, sees the situation clearer, whereas the one who's very angry is not able to see properly. So from the point of view of the angry person, the one who's seeing clearly just has another belief. Yeah. So that's where there is a distortion taking place. Yeah. I'd suggest even these processes are much more relative than the rigor that it is being referred to in this discussion. Okay, well, you're welcome to suggest that. But the bottom line really is, with this entire thing, is really a search for rigor in order to establish what we're calling valid cognition. Is it true that rational analysis is only one gateway to understanding ultimate reality? For example, the pig. I'm not sure about the pig. Well, of course, we would say what we understand with rational analysis enables us to have an understanding of the relative phenomena, and also to have an idea of absolute truth. So it enables us to understand the two truths. But at the end of the day, our intellectual, rational understanding of absolute truth is just what we would call enumerated or categorized absolute truth. It's an understanding of things being dependently arisen and not having, as you could say, solid inherent existence. But that understanding, which is very important, still is just a rational understanding. It's not direct experience. And that's why we would say, for us to actually have direct experience, either takes what we would say 3 countless eons of meditating on the shamatha and vipassana and accumulating merit, or, and this is of course particular to the Vajrayana, we would say on the basis of eliminating obscurations, accumulating merit, and by the blessing of an authentic teacher, it would be possible to have insight into the co-emergent wisdom. And that's where we then go beyond just rational understanding, but entirely operate on the basis of the capacity to be open to the blessing of a teacher. So that's where the initial practice that we're engaging in here, the rational mind, is very helpful in terms of us having faith in the whole process. Otherwise, if we're just sort of giving ourselves over to something that could just be constructed by delusional persons and essentially not reliable, us investigating this rational approach enables a lot of faith. I remember Tsongtse Rinpoche once said, you know, the highest goal that philosophy can provide is really faith. And it's then on the basis of faith, but not blind faith, but on the basis of faith, then there is an appreciation for something greater. And that's particularly then where the Vajrayana perspective in the engagement with the teacher and the right conditions opens up for a direct insight to that which is beyond the rational. So that's where sometimes you would hear the Vajrayana yogis, they sort of go, they poo-poo the rational approach a bit. But of course, for us in the modern world, we are essentially coming from a place in which we have very little exposure to that which is beyond the rational. We haven't grown up with a lot of extraordinary persons and great beings and seen it all around us. So for us to approach the whole panorama, the whole culture of awakening, for us to approach that and to arrive at a place of faith, we initially need to have that critical thinking, because that's where we can validate that, saying, yes, this is something we can trust, something that is valid. It's a bit confusing to read specific phenomena ultimately exist. Do they really? Well, this is the Sautrantika view, and this is particular to, this is particularly to those that would still say there are something out there, something extramental that exists out there. And so that's the Sautrantika approach, is that relative truth is the veiled perceptions that we have, and absolute truth is when we see phenomena beyond the veils. But the pencil is a gummy to a termite whose cognition is valid, both or neither. But exactly, that actually proves what we call relative truth. This here is a gummy, a yummy gummy to a termite, and to me it's a pencil. So that's these examples we've been giving, like also the projector and the ants, right? So you're right. So that makes the point about the two truths. If during a dream I dream that tea is too hot to drink, why is it invalid mental direct perception? Yeah, I kind of agree with you. You're right. Yes. That's a good point. Isn't all cognition at some level dependent on inference? Right from the subtlest level, isn't that core to being relative? Well, yes. Well, that's why I have to take the view of the Western scientist and say, well, yes, but we need to sort of be able to navigate. So that's where we're essentially using that that inference and that sort of relative perception of things to establish our understanding. Sorry for the trouble. What page are we on? So in terms of the book, sorry, I'm going over time here. Let's just see here. Because what I'm doing is essentially, I'm taking, otherwise the book goes into quite some detail, and it would just be, I think, it would be very tough to go through all the various detailed, sort of that the Kempo offers. Anyway, so I think we're on 21, which is on page 93. We're on page 93, page 244. Well, that's probably on the Kindle version. Okay. All right. Well, I hope all of this is helpful. I hope this is, as you could say, sparking some appreciation of the Buddhist teaching. And please, if there's any aspects of this that in any way sort of seems, I don't think it seems daunting. I think everybody's pretty comfortable with this. So I think we're doing okay. Yeah. Hopefully this is sort of landing in a place that prompts reflection and appreciation for the entire project of valid cognition. So I hope this becomes a vehicle for faith in the Buddhist teaching. That's why I sit and do this, just to really appreciate the brilliance of what the Buddha taught. Okay. So dedication. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms, As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you very much.